This second video in the series produced for the Aerostar Owners Association covers start, pre-flight, takeoff, climb, cruise, descent, landing, and shutdown. This video is only meant to be a guide. Each aircraft owner flies the aircraft in a unique way, but by following the POH for the aircraft type, you will be safe. The aircraft used in this video is a 1981 601P converted to a Superstar 1. For your aircraft, follow the pilot's operating handbook if there's any variance. We're now ready for start. The pre-flight inspection has been completed. Check that the seats are locked by rocking them back and forth. Once the final seat position is selected, insert a seat stopper to block the inadvertent sliding of the seat on takeoff. Check that all seat belts are fastened and that the passenger briefing is complete. We check that the cabin door is locked by verifying the position of both indicator pins. Check the gear handle is down. We test the brakes for firm pedals and set the parking brake by holding down the brake pedals, pulling out the knob, and turning it to the right. Then release pressure on the pedals. When we're ready to move, the emergency brake is knocked off by pressing again on the brakes. We will check the flight controls for freedom and correct movement. Turn on the battery master switch. If you have the self-exciting option, turn on both alternators as well. Select takeoff flaps at this time. It will deplete pressure in the accumulator, allowing verification of the hydraulic pump operation. If an APU is used for starting, refer to the POH for your model, as there are differences. Check that both bleed air switches and lights are green. The safety valve switch should be in the normal dump position. If you plan to fly unpressurized, push this switch and it will show dump. Check the landing gear lights. You should see 3 green lights. Push to test the up light. Check the trims. We'll set them for takeoff. For this airplane, the elevator is 1 bar up and the rudder trim is neutral. The electric trims must work in the Aerostar or flight must not be attempted as there is no manual trim. Check the hydraulic shutoff valve is in the up or open position. The fuel totalizer for the fuel on board has been set for 165 gallons. Let's verify the 3 fuel tank gauge readings match what we have set. This might require some aircraft motion. The capacitance probes don't always read full after fueling, even if the tank is full. All annunciator lights should be out, and when we push the test switch, every one should illuminate. We will check for all circuit breakers in. No 2 Aerostars are likely to have the same circuit breaker panel layout, and it's a good idea for the pilot to carry a circuit breaker map close at hand showing the position of every breaker. If you need to pull a breaker, you don't want to be heads down searching. The pressurization controller is never touched by some pilots. Others set it for every flight. If you set the rate knob in the middle, it can stay there. The cabin altitude control for planned altitude can be set during climb out. Set the altimeter and verify the clock setting. Set the engine controls for starting. Prop controls are forward. Mixtures are at idle cutoff. And the throttles are cracked open 1/2 inch. Turn the fuel valves separately to on, then to crossfeed, then back to on, and listen for the sound of 1 electric actuator first, then 2, then 2. Notice that the annunciator light is on when the switch is in the crossfeed position. Turn on the boost pump for the side we are starting first. Today it will be the right. Alternating the engine you start first is a good idea. It proves the function of the check valves on each side of the pneumatic manifold on the 176 panel, and it evens out the start-up loading on the alternator belts. Move the mixture control to full rich for about 6 seconds and then pull it fully back. This is for a cold start. Follow the POH for a hot start. Watch the fuel flow indication as you do this. Disengage the starter as soon as the engine fires. Move the mixture to rich and turn off the boost pump. Lean the mixture at this point to keep from fouling the spark plugs. Watch the hydraulic gauge rise when you start the right engine. This verifies that the hydraulic pump is functioning. Check the oil pressure, and if you don't see at least 30 psi in 10 seconds, shut the engine down. Check the pneumatic air gauge to verify that the pump is working and the red button has disappeared. Reset the throttle to give about 1000 RPM. We're going to start the other side using the same sequence. We can now turn on the radios, autopilot, master, and lights. We will taxi to the run-up area, and on this taxi run, we check the operation of the nose wheel steering switch. Press each of the 4 corners of the switch to ensure that the actuator does not respond. If you're able to steer the airplane with 1/2 of the switch, don't fly. Select a dry run-up spot into the wind with the nose wheel straight. Check the propeller governors at 1500 RPM till the speed drops to 1000 RPM and then back. Verify that the alternator output is roughly 28 volts and that the alternators are sharing the load. Pilots differ on how they do the mag check. I prefer to do them individually, but others do them together. It's whatever you're used to. Look for a max 175 RPM drop from 2100 RPM with not more than a 50 RPM spread. It's now time to pick up your route clearance and request taxi clearance. Verify once again the cabin door is secured and locked. If there's any possibility of an ice encounter during the flight, this is the time to check the operation of the boots and prop heat. Turn on the door seal switch next if you have the electric pump option. This option is recommended for all airplanes to take the load off the engine-driven air pumps. Note the length of time to pump up both seals and then watch the light go out. Move the mixture controls to full rich before taking the runway. Be sure the fuel selectors are both on. Most Aerostar pilots start out every flight with at least a full main tank. Verify that your flight plan is loaded and activated and runway heading is selected on the HSI. Be ready to fly the published departure or navigate to the first fix. Verify the flaps are set for departure and there are no warning lights. Props fine and boost pumps on. Check the seat again. The pins must be engaged. Turn on the landing light or pulse light at this time. Taking off and landing are the riskiest places for a mid-air. Turn on pitot heat if it's needed. The last chance to abort, if anything is not as it should be, is on the takeoff run. If it sounds and feels right, it likely is right. But a quick scan of the engine instruments is a good idea. This engine panel will flash a red warning if any of the parameters are out of tolerance. Brake the wheels after liftoff before retracting the gear. The gear handle operates a hydraulic valve through mechanical linkage, and it takes some effort to move. There is a gate blocking tab on some aircraft that won't allow retraction if the nose gear doesn't fully extend. The position of the nose gear can be seen reflected in the spinner. Once the gear is up, takeoff power can be reduced to climb power and the flaps retracted. There's a big difference in performance between the 700 horsepower airplanes and the lower powered ones. Make sure you are safely clear of obstructions before raising the flaps. In the early climb, verify you have a gear up amber light. Flaps are up and the airspeed makes sense. A typical climb speed is roughly 140 knots. Aerostars were built with several different autopilots. This 1981 601P has a KFC 200 unit and does not have the altitude pre-select common to the 225 models. The paddle switch on the autopilot controller is used to turn on the autopilot. Don't use this switch to turn it off, however. The switch can be easily damaged. Climb power and mixture settings vary from pilot to pilot, from full power to reduced settings. Set the pressurization controller to 1,000 feet above the planned cruising altitude. Once established at cruising altitude, engage the altitude hold and reset the power for cruise. There are so many cruise power combinations, we won't suggest any. Manifold pressure, propeller RPM, and mixture controls all need to be set with limits on turbine inlet temperature and cylinder head temperature observed. Boost pumps are normally turned off upon reaching altitude, but there are several POH versions on this. It's best to use your POH as a guide. Any instability in fuel pressure, however, is reason to turn them on. The pilot should monitor the fuel gauges in flight and through crossfeed balance the wing fuel levels. Aux fuel tanks and fuel extenders complicate things, and the pilot really needs to understand the fuel system on the aircraft. Personally, I like to get to my destination with an hour's worth of fuel remaining. If wing tanks don't flow evenly, typical causes are flying out of trim or leaking wing fuel caps. Aftermarket aileron trim kits are available. A low fuel light means that there is less than 12 gallons of usable fuel left in the fuselage tank, and landing should be made as soon as feasible. Descent in the Aerostar is just a matter of putting the nose down and taking power back slightly. Look for a rate of 500 to 1,000 feet per minute. The Aerostar is a fast airplane. Good descent management and appropriate use of flaps are required to manage speed in descent. Spoilers are available as an aftermarket option, and some pilots find them useful. Set the pressurization controller for 1,000 feet above the landing runway elevation, and the cabin will descend proportionately. Speeds for the approach should be roughly 140 knots, with approach flaps set to 20 degrees. Turn the heater off on final approach. Fuel switches should both be on. Increase the flap setting to 30 degrees on short final once the field is in sight, or roughly half a mile from the threshold. Extend the landing gear at the final approach fix and not in a turn or with side slip. Speed for gear extension should be below 156 knots. Let the speed come back to 120 knots on short final. Select full flaps once the field is made. Check for 3 green lights. Mixture's rich and boost pumps on. Both fuel selectors should be on. Go for 100 knots over the fence. Come back with the trim and touch down at about 80 knots. Hold the nose wheel off for several seconds and then ease the wheel forward to fly the nose wheel on. Letting the nose wheel bang down early will put shock into the hatch section, and if you do it often, you'll be spending serious money fixing cracks in the nose box structure. Till you're off the runway, differential braking ought to be adequate for steering. Depressurize the door seals after landing. The turbos need time to cool down after landing, but usually they have time to cool during the landing rollout and taxi to the ramp. Before shutting down the engines, do an open P-lead check by turning the mags to off and then on. The engine should start to die when the mag switch reaches the off position. If it keeps running, you have a broken P-lead. Shut down in a standard pattern from right to left. Radio master off, mixtures to idle cut off. Check for the appearance of the red pressure ball. Lights off. Alternators and master off.
Wow, what an airplane. Greatest airplane in the world. I've owned 3 of them in my lifetime. I've also owned and flown turbines and jets, but this is the best airplane of them all. But let's talk to Don Smith. Don's got probably 16,000 hours, the highest time Aerostar pilot in the world. Let's see what he has to say about the Aerostar.
When you looked at the Aerostar, just sitting on the ramp, it looked like it was doing about 200 miles an hour compared to the competition that's sitting next to it. And that mid-wing construction, that sleek fuselage, you could just tell it was built for speed. That's one of the reasons why I started with that. I said, maybe one of these days I'll be able to own one of these things. And that has obviously come true.